Welcome back to Tectulia. We're here in Guadalajara, Mexico, at the Wiseline offices here. I'm Matt Pashensky.
And I am Vidal Gonzalez.
So today, I think last time we talked about Guadalajara, and I was looking through the analytics on our podcasting platform, Anchor. And when we talk about Mexico specifically, or at least when it's in the title, we get way more listens.
Yeah.
So I think we should continue to talk about it.
We should,
because
it's a dear topic to ours.
And we get 63% of our listens from Mexico.
Nice.
And then a good portion from the United States, and then some extra ones. But today, I think we should talk about, I think, how to manage big projects. And when we talk about projects, we can talk about obviously running projects within businesses, and there's a lot of pressure financially to deliver projects. So I think that's where a lot of the literature comes from. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot to be gained in any type of realm when you're dealing with a lot of people and using kind of just the normal project management best practices. So today there's a concept called observability that I don't know much about. I kind of get the concept, but you are an expert in it because it's one of these kind of key principles in business for DevOps and other types of software development practices. So we can go into a little about that, but like I said, we want to talk about Guadalajara to get our views up, talk about Mexico to get our views up. So I think it would be interesting to kind of apply some of the principles that you use within software development practices,
right,
to kind of bigger social projects like improving cities and things like that, which is obviously a big topic that other people are going to find interesting if we can figure out a way to solve some of the problems that people face in their day-to-day lives. And a last note before we get going is we are videoing today.
Yeah.
And so if you're watching on YouTube, this is what we look like when we're recording. And we got the skyline in the background of
lovely Guadalajara.
So why don't you kick us off? What's observability? Can you break it down in a few short chunks?
Yeah, I guess it's a very high level concept in a way, because it could be applied to different domains, but in terms at least of software, is the fact that since it's a very intangible, intensive work type, you need to create the right mechanisms to obtain telemetry that then will give you an idea of where work is spent, where both either by human beings or by machines. Right?
Okay, so breaking that down, what's the word telemetry mean? Unless you're a rocket scientist and you already know.
That's a good question. Well, telemetry is all of the data that you gather to measure the performance of a system.
Okay,
right?
so if you're shooting off a rocket, like if you're Apollo 11 or whatever,
right,
you have telemetry coming back from the rocket that's telling you what the temperature of the motor is, how much fuel's on it, the acceleration and things like that. And then from all of that data that goes back to ground control, you could tell, hey, is this rocket performing? And if it blows up,
you know why.
Or if it doesn't do what expected, or if it does do as expected, you can see how to improve.
For example, telemetry has helped improve the security and reliability of the airplane industry, if you will. From where they didn't know why planes go down to now knowing exactly what part of the system failed, because those things are filled up with sensors.
Yeah, and recently that was a big topic. To digress a little bit, because the Boeing released a new airplane that they claimed was the 737, but they had massively changed it, and they had given it to pilots who didn't understand the new systems and how they worked, and based on all the data, they could show pretty quickly exactly why these planes went down. And that's when you have like the black box.
Yeah.
That even if it crashes, the black box
will continue to be intact and have all the data.
Why don't they just make the whole plane out of the black box? Huh?
I don't think that's feasible.
So that's telemetry. So it kind of gives you a backwards look. So when we think about rockets and crashing airplanes and so on, you think about a backwards looking. How else can this type of data be used in kind of forward-looking projects, like when you're building software from scratch?
So when you're building software from scratch, one of the things that you want to take a look at is telemetry will give you a hint of where problems might arise under different conditions. The thing is, especially with software or technology, problems at a certain scale will not be the same as problems at a far different, bigger scale. And when those problems start popping up in a certain part of the system, let's call them little incidents. And this is where the philosophy of incident management comes into play, which is little incidents point to potentially bigger problems that need a re-architecting or rework of a system. And telemetry will help you, say, give you a blip of information over that continuum to know if bigger problems are coming down the line. For example, one blip of it could be the writes to disks are taking longer than expected, right?
Mm-hmm.
It might be that you have an underlying problem with your storage system. Or not, it could be that many systems are trying to write under the same medium, things like that.
And that could be a precursor to bigger problems
Exactly.
like, oh, we can't write anything, and so that's causing all of our applications to break because the writes don't work anymore, and so everybody's getting errors, and nobody can use our service anymore.
Exactly. And observability has become such a big topic these days because the complexity of the systems that we build on the cloud is such that observability is no longer a luxury. Like in the past, observability requires expensive tools. IBM and others would build these expensive tools to sell them along their servers to see how they perform. And now observability is a set of tools and techniques that are used by various teams. They can even use them from open source software. But now when you build software on the cloud, it is imperative that you have some sort of observability into your system, because if you don't know what failed at that scale and with the complexity of the systems today, you won't be able to perform for your users.
So when we talk about when we talk about telemetry and observables and things like that, but just imagining having a car dashboard.
Right.
We got the oil, how hot the oil is. You got the tire pressure now on the gauges, a lot of them in the new cars.
Yeah.
You got how much gas you got.
Yep.
And if any one of those goes bad, your car just stops working.
Yeah.
Right? But then imagine you have 100,000 of those.
Yeah.
And if any one of those goes bad, then your computer system stops working.
Yeah. And observability has allowed for things like what Tesla is doing with self-driving cars, which is basically, yes, you do have a lot of software that is written preemptively to know the behavior of a system, in this case a car, but they're also taking a lot of data points from what they can observe of cars not using the system necessarily today, and the data points that they can gather as they're going through the highway.
And I think the case of Tesla is a very interesting point to talk about observability and how it's used more forward-looking, right? Instead of saying, hey, why did this Tesla explode and light on fire?
Right.
They say, okay, we're looking at exactly how this Tesla's working, but instead of just saying, does it run or not run, they say, how hot's the battery? What's the total voltage drop over, this and that?
Yeah.
And they feed that back all to their developers.
Mm-hmm.
That one of the consequences is Tesla will realize that, hey, we had a margin for error for how fast we could discharge our batteries, and then we realized that what we were worried about never happens, based on the actual observable data that we sent back over the air to the Tesla. I'm assuming Tesla has some kind of cool room with all kinds of numbers on the walls.
Yeah.
And so then they say, well, we can run the battery hotter.
Yeah. And
then they release something and it's like, hey, your Tesla goes 5% faster, or it requires less energy to go the same speed, or it crashes less. Or in the case of the self-driving stuff, it's like, hey, we learned how to avoid crashing into posts and stuff. That used to be a problem. Now we don't do that anymore.
No, and hoping that observability gets built into products, you get a chance as a developer of products, either both physical or just intangible products like software. You get the advantage of being able to mature those products more fast, right? Or faster, I'm sorry. The point being, for example, in the past, you will have these huge recalls by car manufacturers because they will find problems later on their development process of that car. Mm-hmm. Right now, Tesla could potentially issue changes to the manufacturing of those lines because they have the observability on those cars.
They learn earlier.
They learn earlier, exactly.
So we're talking about, I think, a pretty kind of abstract kind of idea of analytics and all this stuff. let's and this is why I want to talk about Guadalajara, aside from the ratings bump that we'll necessarily get by just
using the word or
it's
talking
a
about
magic
the city.
word.
Yeah.
You always got to find the local angle to everything.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about motivation and the kind of resilience of a group of people who's trying to accomplish something,
Right.
how can you use these observables? You often talk about having a kind of a visible office. What do you call it when you have all the crap on the
visible
walls?
workplace. I'm sorry.
So when you talk about this, a visible workplace. So say we're running an application. You want to have the people who are responsible for making that application work see some very important numbers at all times up on the walls.
Yeah.
And that is going to incentivize them to say, hey, look, your memory usage is creeping up.
Yeah.
That might be a problem. Or your CPU utilization is is coming up. Or if something goes wrong, it's not like 3 hours later that you get a call from somebody. It's like 10 seconds later, there's a big red flashing light and something goes wrong. So obviously that has benefits for both motivating the team.
Yeah.
Because if you put the right numbers up on the wall and they keep those numbers where they need to be, then you have a very well-maintained application.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, I think, resiliency, by showing people problems before they emerge, you just decrease the risk that something creeps up on you and becomes a huge issue.
Yeah, no, and we're very visible creatures, right? Like whatever we can see with our eyes and can put into perspective gives us a notion of where things are at. I'll take a little bit of deviation to a campaign that I remember. I think it was run in New York City a while ago where they were against people smoking, right? Cigarettes. And one of the ways that they would create a big impression through observability, I guess, that applies is they ran an ad where they built up a pile of body bags. And you could see the pile being like 4 meters high. What's that in feet? I don't know, right? 13 something feet, right? High. It was like, whoa. And they said, like, this is the amount of people that die every month or something due to lung-related cancer or something. And that's a very visible representation. Because if you tell you, oh, once every 4 minutes somebody dies of cancer, you're like, yeah, that's scary. But when you actually see a mountain of body bags, you're like, holy, that could happen. That could be that guy. Right?
So what are the types? So I mean, obviously, getting people to stop smoking is important, and but as far as running a city,
right?
We got the Guadalajara back out there. What are the things that we should be measuring and making clearer,
right,
to people? Like, and how can we use technology to make it more observable, make it more visible,
right?
And what kinds of changes in people's behaviors and the behaviors of politicians, and do we think we could enable by doing that?
That's a great question. I yesterday you were discussing this thing about buses, right? And we won't get into that, but one of the things that you were discussing is, well, there needs to be data in order to take action. And I believe that as citizens and as the government, we should be able to contribute to the collective of data created through observations of what we do every day in order to improve the services that we have. And I mean, it's not only just putting sensors everywhere, but probably contributing through means, either manual or automatic, or building applications to help the government gather data of how people are using electricity. What do they do with their water supply? Things like that. Or what's their commute like? Like, the government would never know those kinds of things unless we provide that data. But we also need to understand.
When's the highway to Puerto Vallarta going to be finished?
Right.
That's one I want to know.
No, but the thing is that hand in hand with observability comes a strategy for data gathering that then should be put to use to be able to make decisions. Observability.
So I read this thing. I was reading the local newspaper.
Yeah.
I'm practicing my vocabulary. I'm trying to improve it, right? So, and I read this thing in the newspaper that they had set up these microphones all around town to like figure out where the noise was coming from, and they could kind of triangulate where people were making noise, and then they would send people out to turn off the noise.
Really?
Yeah. It's been quieter lately, I feel like.
In Guadalajara?
I don't know, maybe.
Yeah.
I got a little terraza next door where they do karaoke at night. But yeah, once that goes away, it gets pretty quiet.
Yeah.
They should be able to find people's dogs that bark too much. I know that you have dogs that bark.
I do have dogs. There is a way to add data points to the barking, but
when we talk about observability, like what is you've lived here a long time. You have a better understanding of what's going on. What is currently available that would show you what the traffic is like in various parts of the city, where there's more or less pollution or trash, where there's crime, where there's dogs barking? Like, are there any kinds of public institutions that would allow people to kind of put that data out there?
I'm not familiar with any, and excuse me if I don't have a good answer for which organism of the government does that. I do understand that different parts of the government kind of publish that data, the guys that's running the weather, so on and so forth. But I think it would be an interesting concept to have an office run by the government that is in charge of giving that observability to the population as well as to the government. I don't think there's a central organism that can do that.
And I think, when we think about kind of how it would create incentives and improve things, when it's very clear where the problems are, then it does two things. Number one, the government can't claim that like, oh, well, things are good. It's like,
right.
No, they're bad.
Right.
And second, if you have reliable data, it gives you a way to get small wins.
Yeah.
Right? Say there's like between 50 and 100 murders a month in a place, right? Like that would be pretty bad. But like say we don't even measure it, right? You just know that there's a lot of bodies. Maybe you look at the pile, right? And then the government puts a whole lot of work into improving murders. But then you're like, yeah, there's still murders.
Right.
Right? Now, if on the other hand, you know that like, hey, here's all of the murders, violent crimes, all of this stuff, and you break it down and you record everything, and then they do stuff and you can show statistically like, oh, they decrease the likelihood of someone getting murdered by 15%. That's really good.
Yeah.
Because if you could do that a few times, well, obviously it would kind of exponentially decay, but like, if you can really make an impact like that, 15% decline in murder is fantastic.
Yeah.
And it's worth millions of dollars and a lot of effort. And if you're a politician, you should be rewarded for those types of things if you're implementing those things, or if you're the chief of police.
Yeah.
And actually there was a system, it was a crime computer. I forget what it's called. But in New York, the chief of police basically created a central repository that recorded all crimes.
Okay.
And so the local police, because they were kind of in a similar situation where the chief of police in New York City's like 25 million people, right? So all these little departments would kind of juke the stats and stuff. So they made every 911 call, everything's logged, right? And so it made it very difficult to say, oh, we're doing a good job. Instead, it was like, here's the number, and either the number's improving or it's not improving, right? And there's ways to game it and things like that. But I think those types of systems in our day and age where we have the ability to collect almost infinite amounts of data for free, to store it for free, to process it for free. I mean, we're talking about, how much does it cost to do 1 million points of data, processing these days? Like a penny, 10 cents. Like it's just impossibly cheap with cloud technology these days. And I don't think really anyone's taking advantage of this. Certainly not in this city that we know of, but what's the average travel time? And just to go back to something I'm constantly thinking about, is like, what's the travel time between your house and the office, or between any 2 points? Like you can't incentivize people to improve those things and to make the hard choices necessary if you don't give them any credit for succeeding. And I think that's something that applies to software, but it could apply to cities too.
Yeah, and the last thing that I want to add on observability is like also providing perspective of a time series perspective, right? Like sometimes populations or governments tend to report their data as if it was static, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or probably compare it, if you're lucky, to last year. But never do you see data presented in a perspective where this is how much we've improved. Probably the crime rate in Guadalajara right now could look like pretty bad. But if you actually map it out to the number of people in the city, the influx of people that has come to the city,
Right.
and map it over time, you'll be like, actually, we're doing far better. And on that note, I would like to recommend a book that talks a little bit about observability of data, but more in the general sense, called Factfulness.
Factfulness. I need to go read that. You mentioned that last time.
It's a beautiful book.
And I want to get it.
Yeah.
So just to wrap up, I think a few takeaways. I think if you're someone listening to this, I would say, like, if there are things that you think could be measured, or you know of different ways to measure it, obviously contact us or let us know. It'd be really good to see if we could get some people together just to make some of this data available.
Yeah.
Make it public. Not in a way that, like, we're trying to get anybody in trouble or trying to cause trouble, but instead just, hey, let's start with making things visible.
Yeah.
Let's start with coming up with simple ways to measure things. Let's make it visible. And then once it's visible, once it's observable, then we can start to say, hey, what are some strategies to improve this by a little or that by a little bit? Or where are we having decreasing, worsening problems, where a problem is actually getting better, might not be an issue that we need to worry about for much longer. And how does that vary across the city?
Yeah.
It just feels like that's something that is a pretty low-hanging fruit now, and I would be really interested if people had ideas or wanted to work on it. I mean, I think we have people in the office all the time that we're starting projects, we're looking at ways of addressing it. That creates a lot of opportunities for new technology companies in the future. It creates a lot of opportunities to improve the city. But the first thing you got to do is just start to have these discussions, bring it to the surface, and start to track it. So
yeah, and like you said, observability is cheap these days because you can gather a lot of data points, store it in the cloud for cheap, and the benefits that it brings are huge. Starting with security, right? Reliability of systems.
Yeah,
you name it.
I think all this money that we gave to Facebook and Google over the last 20 years
should pay off.
It's there's a lot of cheap stuff now that they perfected, and we can start using it for other ends. But anyway, hopefully that's an interesting way that we can connect kind of how we can start to make more progress in a nonpartisan fashion in politics and group motivation, and how a lot of that connects back to a lot of the problems that we've been solving, not we, but computer people have been solving for the past few years that are now standard in software. So let's I think we wrap this up for the week. Next week, because we're recording back to back, we will be talking about disruption.
That's a very interesting topic.
And I'm going to talk about Guadalajara again.
All right.
All right. So thanks, everybody. See you next time. Hope you enjoyed the short episode, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.